So good afternoon, good evening, and good morning to all, wherever you are. In the name of UNDES's Division for Inclusive Social Development, I would like to welcome you and to thank you for joining us today. My name is Alcinda Hanuana. I'm an interregional advisor on social development policy at the Division, and I'm the main organizer of this side event to the United Nations High-Level Political Forum. Today, we will be discussing how to build back better after the pandemic, with a focus on issues regarding health, work, and well-being. As we think about the future and how to optimize the implementation of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, I think we must bear in mind that the pandemic is not over yet, as new variants and new waves of infections continue to affect several countries across the globe, especially in the global south. So with that in mind, we need to reflect about how to tackle our present challenges with a view to building strong foundations for a better future. And today we have an excellent panel to lead us in this conversation. We are extremely grateful to them for making time out of their very, very busy schedules to be with us today. Our moderator is Professor Jomo Kwame Sundaram, a senior advisor at the Kazana Research Institute, emeritus professor of economics, and fellow of the Academy of Science in Malaysia. Professor Jomo has been for a long time with United Nations. He was Assistant Secretary General at UNDES from 2005-2012 and Deputy Director at FAO for several years as well. It is a pleasure to have him back. Our speakers will be Dr. Michel Sidibé, the African Union Special Envoy for the African Medicines Agency. He served as Executive Director of UNAIDS and Minister of Health and Social Affairs in Mali. And Dr. Sidibé has been a champion for a people-centered approach to health and development. We have also Professor Georgie Tsikata, a research professor of development sociology at the University of Ghana, Legon. She has developed excellent research on gender and development policies, on women's movements, on the politics of work and livelihoods, as well as on land tenure reform. We have also Dr. Duncan Green, a senior strategic advisor and head of research at Oxfam UK. Duncan is also a professor in practice at the Department of International Development at LSE, and he runs a daily blog on development which addresses critical issues of our times. And we have also Aisha Constable, an activist with the Young People for Action on Climate Change in Jamaica. Aisha is also the Caribbean representative for the Sustainable Development Solutions Youth Network. Aisha is a strong advocate for women's or young women's leadership and for climate justice issues. Jomo, Michel, Georgie, Duncan, and Aisha, thank you so much for being here with us, and we look forward to your reflections on these pressing issues. And without further ado, I'm handing it over to Jomo. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alcinda, for those kind words of introduction. It's a pleasure to be with all of you at this time. There are so many different time zones in which we are all to be found. And so I will not go through all the different time zones. We have an excellent panel, as Cinda has reminded us. And I think the best way to facilitate stimulating discussion is to allow our speakers to speak first, and then we will open it up for discussion. And I hope to have a very constructive and useful debate on many of the challenges which we all face together in this world. So without any further ado, allow me, it is my great pleasure to invite my former colleague from over a decade ago, Dr. Michel Sidibe, with all his rich experience to address us. Dr. Sidibe, please.
Thank you very much, my friend Jogo. I am so happy to see you there. It is with pleasure that I am joining this great panel today. But unfortunately, I will continue in French. Déjà avant la pandémie de la COVID-19 ne se répande, des preuves s'accumulaient un peu partout qu'on était en retard. L'absence de mise en échelle était nécessaire pour atteindre les objectifs durables. Mais le nouveau coronavirus a complètement perturbé nos positions dans le monde. On s'est retrouvé avec des habitudes qui ont été changées. Nous sommes confrontés tous à une crise sans précédent qui répand la souffrance et bouleverse la vie des populations. Cette pandémie est véritablement mondiale. Nous ne devons cependant pas être frappés de myopie. Nous avons un besoin urgent de travailler ensemble. Il est crucial de réinventer un nouveau modèle de solidarité et parachever une plus grande équité entre les nations. Plus que jamais, le système multilatéral doit être soutenu. La crise de la COVID-19 n'a épargné aucun des 19 objectifs de développement durable qui paraissent tout d'un coup hors de portée. Chacun de ces objectifs enregistre un grave recul en ce qui concerne les femmes, les enfants et le climat. Dans les secteurs de l'éducation et surtout de la santé, la pandémie a fait apparaître de graves inégalités entre les pays. Dans les pays en développement, en marge de la gestion de la pandémie de la COVID-19, les services de santé maternelle et infantile, le traitement du VIH et du paludisme, les services voués au traitement des maladies chroniques comme l'hypertension, les maladies cardiaques et rénales ont tous été gravement affectés. À ce jour, le déploiement mondial des vaccins contre la COVID-19 n'est ni inclusif ni planifié de manière adéquate et ce déploiement présente un biais en faveur des pays développés. Nous assistons à une fracture criante entre le Nord et le Sud. Nous avons ainsi les pays dits du Nord, ceux qui ont amplement les vaccins, et les pays dits du Sud, notamment une Afrique laissée pour compte avec seulement 1,6% des vaccins mondialement disponibles. Au rythme actuel, les besoins en vaccins pour l'Afrique pourraient ne pas être couverts avant 2024. C'est triste de le dire, nous sommes en face d'un apartheid vaccinal. Il faut également souligner que la pandémie n'est pas encore terminée. Nous avons encore beaucoup à faire pour la combattre. Aujourd'hui, nous assistons dans les régions où les infections se multiplient à l'émergence de nouveaux variants encore plus dangereux du virus. Avec le niveau actuel de couverture vaccinale, le risque est très grand de rendre le coronavirus endémique sur l'ensemble du continent africain et peut-être également au-delà dans d'autres régions du monde. Dans l'immédiat, rien n'est plus urgent que la nécessité de maîtriser les deux crises, l'une sanitaire et l'autre économique, qui s'abattent sur le monde. De nombreux gouvernements ne peuvent pas efficacement faire face à cette situation et de nombreuses institutions se fissurent. Ainsi, il faut concevoir des réponses fiscales et monétaires qui permettent au gouvernement d'amortir les répercussions de ces deux crises sur la vie de millions de personnes tout en allégeant le fardeau qui plombe les pays les moins bien lotis face aux conséquences de la pandémie. Déjà confrontés au surendettement, plusieurs pays en développement connaissent par ailleurs des vulnérabilités financières qui limitent leur capacité de réponse à la crise. Selon les dernières estimations des Nations Unies, l'Afrique, la deuxième région la plus peuplée du monde, compte aujourd'hui un peu moins d'1,4 milliard d'habitants, ce qui équivaut à presque 17% de la population mondiale, mais les 55 pays de l'Union africaine supportent une charge de morbidité disproportionnée, soit un quart de la morbidité mondiale. Ces pays comprennent aussi 60% des personnes vivant avec le VIH et plus de 90% des cas annuels de paludisme dans le monde. Additionnellement, avec seulement 6% des dépenses de santé et moins de 1% du marché pharmaceutique mondial, elle ne produit que 3% des médicaments utilisés par ses habitants et 1% des vaccins. La pandémie nous rappelle de façon urgente qu'il est important de produire les vaccins en Afrique et les médicaments en Afrique. Consacré les derniers mois depuis que j'ai eu l'honneur d'avoir été désigné par l'Union africaine de porter ce défi, nous devons déployer tous les efforts nécessaires pour établir de toute urgence l'Agence africaine du médicament. Permettez-moi d'être candide, les défis pour établir l'Agence africaine du médicament sont nombreux. Ces défis sont entre autres financiers. Il y a aussi la réticence des pays riches à réduire, voire combler les inégalités de santé qui prévalent en raison des bénéfices, qui s'arrogent les grands groupes pharmaceutiques. Par ailleurs, tout doit être entrepris pour renforcer les systèmes de réglementation des médicaments et des vaccins en accélérant précisément l'opérationnalisation de l'Agence africaine du médicament. En s'appuyant sur la zone de libre-échange continentale africaine, l'Agence africaine du médicament permettra d'harmoniser les réglementations en matière d'enregistrement des médicaments et des vaccins et aidera les pays à se conformer aux meilleures pratiques et normes internationales. Relevons donc tous ces défis dans l'intérêt de la famille des nations. La lutte contre cette pandémie étant une priorité, l'Agence africaine du médicament devra s'engager à court terme à répondre tout d'abord aux besoins de vaccins contre la COVID-19 en Afrique. Dans le plus long terme, l'agence permettra de renforcer la lutte contre le fléau des médicaments et des produits médicaux contrefaits de qualité douteuse ou inférieure, tout en favorisant la mise en place d'un environnement propice à la production de médicaments et de vaccins sur notre continent. Nous pourrons par ailleurs profiter de la richesse de notre flore pour valoriser et promouvoir la pharmacopée africaine. Une importante recommandation visera à donner à l'agence les moyens et la légitimité pour encadrer ou accompagner les efforts des chercheurs et de tous ceux qui s'adonnent sérieusement à explorer le potentiel extraordinaire de la pharmacopée africaine. En conclusion, il devient urgent de passer d'un système centré sur la maladie et le soin à un système de santé centré sur l'humain, ce qui inclut la prévention individuelle et collective. En une phrase, il s'agit de passer de l'offre de soins à une offre de santé. Cependant, pour espérer pouvoir mettre en œuvre cette orientation, traitant la santé comme un bien commun, disons plutôt un bien public, échappant tant que faire se peut à la logique du profit et ne devant être ni étatisé ni privatisé, il nous faudra repenser nos approches à travers un vrai débat mondial sur la démocratie sanitaire. Je vous remercie.
Merci beaucoup, Dr. Sidibé. Thank you very much for a very good introduction to the range of issues which we face and the particular response of the African Union and the attempts to create the African Medical Agency. This will be a very important initiative which we hope to see further in the discussion. Without further ado, let me invite Professor Kata to address us.
Thank you very much. I first of all want to thank the organizers of this side event, especially our sender, Honwana, and her team for inviting me to participate, and to thank my old friend Jomo for moderating this conversation. I want to start with a quote from a speech by the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres in 2020, which was music to my ears, because it described COVID as an X-ray of the dysfunctionalities of our societies and economies and the global economic order. And here I quote, it says, COVID-19 has been likened to an X-ray, revealing fractures in the fragile skeleton of the societies we have built. It is exposing fallacies and falsehoods everywhere. The lie that free markets can deliver healthcare for all, the fiction that unpaid care work is not work, the delusion that we live in a post-racist world, the myth that we are all in the same boat. While we are all floating in the same sea, it's clear that some are in super yachts while others are clinging to the drifting debris. End of quote. The Secretary General's words are supported by a growing body of research and policy documents on COVID-19 effects that have highlighted the question of structural inequalities in ways that even all the hard work that the UN did around the SDGs and the 2016-2018 global financial and food and energy crisis could not do. Secondly, COVID-19 has demonstrated the importance of paying attention to the interlinked pillars of sustainability, the economic, the social, and the environmental. And this implies that the focus on the two goals in our panel, our side events, goal 3 on health and well-being, and goal 8 on decent work and economic growth, must necessarily also devote attention to how these are connected with other SDG goals, especially goal 1 on poverty eradication, 2 on zero hunger, 10 on reducing inequalities, and 13 on climate action, and 16 on peace, justice, and strong institutions. Addressing the decent work and economic growth agenda would not succeed without efforts to address food insecurity and the poverty, and the other way around also operates. In the COVID-19 era, we have seen that the volatility in food availability and food prices has been deadly for workers in the informal economy who are facing growing unemployment and a contraction in their already low wages and earnings. My second point is that to build back better and to leave no one behind, we need to examine why so many gains have proved vulnerable under this crisis, and in some cases have been rolled back. We need to understand the reasons for the contraction of economies, for increased levels of political crisis, for the loss in employment and the growing precarity of work, and the growth in the numbers of what people are calling the new poor, the rising levels of youth unemployment, the school attrition rates in rural and poor communities and also among girls, the rise in teenage pregnancy, the gender-based violence which has exploded, the expansion in reproductive work being done by women, and the growth in the volatility of food availability and food prices, and the threats of food insecurity. My third point is that we also need to understand that the reason for what we are seeing now, this problem of the worsening of our situation, has to do with the fact that in many parts of Africa, even before COVID, we were enduring conditions which had been described as a crisis within a crisis. Many countries were experiencing economic and social difficulties. The multi-party constitutional rule system was in crisis in many parts of Africa. And basically, we can see this in the heightened political tension, the unrest, the flaring up of civil wars, the distrust for governments, with citizens expressing suspicion of government intentions about this, and also about the seriousness of the pandemic. The recent events in South Africa are a reminder of some of these things, but we saw them in so many other countries before, in Nigeria, in Uganda, in Ghana, and so on. My fourth point is that responses to the COVID crisis have generally been short-term, ill-targeted, a lot of hits and misses, and the containment measures and the mitigation measures have not worked too well so far. And we see a race to vaccinate African citizens, a process which has been hampered by rising vaccine hesitancy and vaccine nationalism and the hoarding of vaccines by Western countries. While this is understandable, the fact that countries are focusing on short-term measures, it is also important in this moment of crisis to begin to think in terms of the medium and the long term, and also to begin to return to fundamental questions of our economic and social order. Furthermore, we see that the dominant economic and social policies are not fit for purpose. I want to focus on the social protection systems that we have in Africa because they've come under scrutiny in this period. Basically, we know that they are retreats from a more expansive approach to social development, and they have proved unable to address the challenges that have been enumerated, particularly the question of the loss of insecure jobs, the inability of the private sector to pay the wages of workers consistently, and the expansion of the numbers of people who need social protection and other benefits since the pandemic began. Given all what one has said before, I think that what we require now is a new social contract between citizens and society, and also a rededication to long-term planning, to structural transformation, and to agrarian transitions. This requires a fundamental rethinking of economic, social, and environmental policies and their interactions, and how these can achieve sustainable development, which is gender and class equitable. In this connection, the SDGs should become a means of demanding accountability, signposts, if you like, not ends in themselves. I want to stress that in the question of gender equitable and transformative social policy, which is back on the policy agenda, we are required to answer the questions about the most effective social policy approaches for strengthening productive capacities, for ensuring social reproduction, redistributions, and social cohesion in African countries which are largely agrarian or non-industrialized economies that are dominated by self-employment and unpaid family work. Only if we do this can we promote a prosperous and just Africa and healthy societies. The UN system therefore needs to support these processes by going beyond the SDGs agenda and opening up a new era of fundamental conversations. I'd like to end here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Georgie. Thank you, Professor Sikata, for those very useful words of describing the situation closer to the ground. They complement very much the earlier remarks. I've been reminded by Alcinda, who's leading the organizing team, that you are all encouraged to make comments and particularly raise questions in the chat function, a Q&A function, in order, and these will be collected by the very able team behind the scenes for our discussion later. So please feel free to make your comments using that function. Without further ado, it's my pleasure to invite yet another old friend, Professor Duncan Green, currently with the LSA, but also holding a number of hats in relation to his long-term activism and involvement with civil society movements of global nature. Professor Green.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Alcinda and the UN team for the invitation, and it's a real honor to be on this panel, I must say. The first two speakers have been absolutely brilliant, and I'm feeling a little bit intimidated. I'll start off. I've got 2 points I want to make. One is to give an illustration of the kind of topics that Georgie touched on, and then the second one was to think a little bit more about the politics of achieving the kind of things I think everybody on this call is interested in achieving. So the first, in terms of COVID as this X-ray, in the words of the Secretary General, or as an inequality engine, looking at the issue of decent work, is a new paper by some colleagues, Anouk Frank and Art Prappa at Oxfam, on supermarkets, because in many countries, the supermarkets have been one of the boom winners of the crisis. Everybody has piled into supermarkets to stock up. And so Oxfam did a very interesting report called Not in This Together, looking at comparing what supermarkets have done and how their workers have fared in seafood, wine, coffee, rice, and tea, 5 big commodities. And the findings are quite shocking. Basically, the supermarkets have made a huge amount of money, and that has nearly all gone to shareholders. So in just 8 months between 2019 and 2020, as the pandemic took off, total dividends distributed to shareholders by the 8 big supermarkets increased by 123% from 10 billion to 22.3 billion. At the same time, many workers in many supply chains were losing jobs, getting squeezed. Even before the pandemic, the workers' share of the final price people pay in supermarkets in these commodities was around 1%. So that's the first finding, that the benefits of this supermarket boom have gone to shareholders, not to the workers in supply chains. And that has been reflected in wage inequality. So in 2018, before the pandemic, it would have taken a woman worker processing shrimp in a typical Thailand plant more than 4,000 years to earn what the chief executive of a top US supermarket earned in a year. In 2020, it had gone up nearly 50%, 5,700 years for that woman to earn the same as the super. So the kind of policy implications, as Georgie said, we have to rethink the social contract, in this case, between business and workers, not just between states and citizens. And I think there's real potential in mainstreaming human rights in corporate policies and practices. And we've been working at Oxfam with many supermarkets and other big companies, and we've seen some positive signs in the UK. So that's the first topic I wanted to raise. But then the second one is more general. COVID is a classic shock, a critical juncture in political science parlance. Change in society and politics and economics often happens around these moments, these big shocks. We've seen pandemics act as drivers of change through history. In the European, the great plagues in Europe in the 15th, 14th century led to the end of feudalism, massive changes. But they don't always lead to big changes. I think back to 2008, and I think I had quite a lot of dealings with Germo at this point, when we had high hopes that the financial crisis of 2008 would lead to a new world order. We all thought the G20 was going to become a kind of global steering committee, definancialization, putting back the financial sector into some sort of box. Hasn't happened. So some shocks are squandered and some are transformative. So we're seeing what could come out of the COVID shock. And I absolutely agree with what Alcinda said right at the beginning. In the UK right now, we're feeling a little bit post-COVID. I've had my vaccinations, I've had most people in the UK. That is very much an outlier in terms of the world. And we're seeing a disastrous move to the south in terms of COVID morbidity going on very fast at the moment. But the possible legacies we're seeing is a revitalization of the role of the state. COVID has one of the fringe sort of slight sort of silver linings of COVID is it seems to be toxic for populism. So you've seen Bolsonaro, Trump, Duterte really struggle because this has demonstrated that it really matters to have a state that functions and that doesn't just chase headlines and chase hatred. There's a possibility that this could lead to a step change in social protection systems, as Georgie was talking about. It shows the importance of money, power, and technology. The whole discussion around vaccine apartheid and the people's vaccine has brought home yet again the imbalance of power between North and South, between the have-yots and the have-nots. And is another possibility would be a truly global health system, the kind of thing that we've heard about already this afternoon. So we have a moment when there seems to be some sort of consensus or coalition for change, but those moments pass. So I think the interesting question is, what do you do to institutionalize these kind of ideas before the momentum shifts and the spotlight moves on? Is it that we need new laws at national level? Is it we need new rules on how decisions are made? Do you try and create permanent constituencies with more power and voice that will stay with these topics after the pandemic has ended? Is it about transparency? Is it about things like shifting norms? Oxfam's work on inequality has primarily been around the idea that extreme inequality is unjust. And that's been a much bigger impact than coming up with lots of clever policy answers. So is it about shifting bigger social opinions? And final comment on the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, they're quite weak in terms of institutionalization. There's a lot of best endeavors language, but not many teeth. So is this a moment when we could actually introduce more teeth into the SDG machinery, a regular league table of performance against the different SDGs so that countries can be compared more directly, or some other idea? We need to seize this moment and try and make it permanent. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Sorry. Thank you very much, Duncan. Thank you, Professor Green. Let me thank you for highlighting and focusing on a number of issues which are of grave concern, following up very nicely from some of the issues raised by Professor Sikata earlier. Let me now invite our fourth and last speaker before our discussion, and also our youngest speaker in this panel, Aisha Constable from Jamaica. Aisha, please.
Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, depending on where you are. Thank you so very much to Elsin and the team for extending this invitation to me. I'm truly, truly honored to have the opportunity to speak on this panel. I echo a lot of the sentiments, if not all the sentiments that the previous presenters have put forward. And usually whenever I get this platform, I'm quick to say that I speak not just on behalf of myself, but on behalf of the millions of young people who call the Global South home, but more so the Caribbean region. The task is mine to try and summarize in 5 minutes all that I have to say, and it is indeed a lot, but I'm going to try to stay on time. COVID, the work, health, well-being situation as it is, I think one of the things that we saw early on was that it was inaccurately conceptualized as an equalizer, the great equalizer, because everybody would have fared similarly due to COVID. We've seen everything but that. And the reality is that we've seen that the Global South has been disproportionately impacted by COVID, and it is in fact not an equalizer. An intersectional approach is necessary to analyze the impacts, and we cannot analyze these impacts in isolation of each other because they have been exacerbated and compounded by each other. And these impacts have been clearly demonstrated in work, health, and well-being issues in the regions. And societies in the Caribbean in particular have been affected, or the disparities in these impacts have been most evident among poor people, youth, older persons, persons with disabilities, women and girls, rural people. In the spirit of the conversation, I'd like to point out that in our experience, the capitalist patriarchal regime and ideas and models of economic development have proven to be fallible. And in our case, the downturn in mass tourism and cruise tourism in particular, cruise shipping, has been like a Band-Aid ripped off a gaping wound. And we have been forced to reconcile with economic volatility, gender inequality, and climate vulnerability in the region. In linking it to Goal 8, the matter of decent work and sustainable livelihoods, I'd like to highlight the importance of education in this target, in this goal. Recognizing that education is key to development of sustainable livelihoods and to access to decent work. And in the case of the Caribbean, we have recognized that the gap in the digital divide has brought about a significant lapse in education and learning for the most vulnerable in our societies. And so the loss in knowledge among poor households, among rural households is great. And some of these children may never be able to get back on track. I want to point to 2 examples of ways in which we've been treating with this particular issue or the manifestation of this challenge in Jamaica, for example. So we've seen in rural communities where teachers and principals of primary education institutions are using bikes, motorbikes, to take assignments to children on a weekly basis. Applaudable as it is, it's not sustainable. Applaudable as it is, there are other factors that ensure that it will not attain the goal that we would like ideally of education, where students are in a classroom setting and able to be in a safe, consistent environment where they're learning. So that has also been with its own challenges. Similarly, we've seen cases where poor households have up to 5 children in a household and they're sharing one smartphone. Again, a parent now, in many instances, a single mother now has to make a decision and determination, which child do I allow to use this gadget, one day of the week, and sharing, and again, trying to maximize the situation and make the best of the situation in a circumstance like that. And so generally, we see that, there are in some instances, some policy measures to respond to these challenges. In some instances, they're draconian and authoritative, and again, reversing gains we've made in labor markets and workers' rights issues in the Caribbean. Domestic workers are among those most significantly affected in the world, and in the Caribbean, it's no different. In the case of Jamaica, we saw where government instituted a cash transfer policy that domestic workers were not able to tap into because of the informal nature of their work. Young people across the spectrum are uncertain about their futures due to COVID-19. We're uncertain before as well because the challenges were still present, but more so now. And there's an expectation that young people should be creative when at this time, young people are simply trying to survive through this horrendous time. Goal 3, as relates to women's empowerment and equity, I'll speak to the case of the Caribbean as it in relation to women's rights and access to sexual and reproductive health and amenities, the increased burden of care and the undervaluation of the care economy. And so we've seen in many cases across the region, again, where there's a reduced access to sexual and reproductive health care and products, leading to an increase in unplanned pregnancies, high incidence, increase again in the presence of female-led single-parent households, and an increase in the number of unsafe abortions that are being carried out. And I'd like to just dub that a case of, again, the presence of feminization of poverty, and we're seeing that increasingly across the region as a result of the pandemic. There are also increased incidents of rape and abuse among our children because they're now in homes where their predators exist. School was a safe space for a lot of these children, and now they're forced to stay at home where they're preyed upon. And schools also played a significant role in ensuring food security among children. In some instances, they would have gotten meals that they're now not getting access to while being at home away from school under these lockdowns. And again, among our women and girls, we see the rise of what we call the shadow pandemic, the impacts on women and girls in terms of physical abuse, again, being meted out in these homes that they can no longer escape from. In many countries of the Caribbean, Jamaica included, we do not have a case of ready access to shelters. And so what we've seen in some instances are other citizens taking in these victims of abuse. But again, there's a pushback because of the risk of COVID infections, by doing so. And so again, people are forced to stay in these harmful situations. Just to say that, to sum that up, I'd say that women are not doing well. Women are under severe stress and pressure and strain, and there's an expectation that we will put on our capes and come out with a brave face to work and to school and, just get things done as a superwoman that we're supposed to be and claim to be. Young women who are juggling, I say to young women who are juggling school while trying to fend off their predators in homes that they're no longer safe, to mothers juggling care roles and women juggling, careers and care roles, it's okay to not be okay at this time because we know you're not doing well. And it's fine if men want to say that about their own counterpart, but I speak on behalf of the constituency that I represent. And so my ask to decision makers and governments is to approach the process of policy making and planning in a gender responsive manner, but not in a tokenistic way, but rather in a one that embraces an approach to human rights, or the embracement of human rights in a people-centered manner to make it truly responsive to the needs of the people that we serve. And then I'll be remiss to not speak on climate change and environmental justice. COVID-19 is what we call the dress rehearsal for climate. In so many ways, it has shown, pointed us to what will happen if we continue to operate in the same way as we have been, in a business as usual approach to development. And COVID-19 is happening simultaneously with climate change. So climate change is not on pause while COVID-19 figures out what it's doing. It's happening concurrently. Recently in the Caribbean, we had one hurricane hit us, Hurricane Elsa. We had significant flooding in some parts of the Caribbean. So governments and people are juggling these dual issues. And so we've seen a loss of livelihoods, increased vector-borne diseases as a result of climate change. And because of COVID, the glaring gaps in our health system are again being worsened. And then overall, just the psychological health impacts that people are carrying as a result of these dual challenges. And so I say that the loss of lives and catastrophic impacts of COVID has not spurred action. And so I do not feel a sense of reassurance that the loss of lives that we have seen as a result of climate change are going to spur us to action. Because if what we've seen with COVID across the world is not causing governments to, jump on this bandwagon of providing support, medical support and vaccines to countries, why should people in the global south feel that the death tolls that we have had as a result of climate change are going to be what spurs our global leaders to action? There's no reassurance there. We are scared. The reversal of resilience gains in many countries across the region due to COVID will leave us more vulnerable to climate impacts. Health, economic, everything else in every sector, education, we've seen reversal of gains that we've made in SDGs over the years reverse significantly. And just as we're planning for scenarios that span 100 years in climate change, we need to build back our societies to bolster capacity to respond to the pandemic, not just in the short term, but for another pandemic in another few decades or even longer. We cannot do short-term fixes. And to sum it up, I'll say that COVID-19 is without a doubt reinforcing the global dichotomy, is reinforcing this architecture of global inequality that some countries seem so intent on holding on to. And so the historical, in the global south and in the Caribbean, I say the historical antecedents of colonialism, which shape our realities, cannot be ignored. It is largely why people are hesitant about the vaccine, as well as say people do not trust the sources of these vaccines and the systems that are overseeing these processes. I know it sounds like doom and gloom, but I know there's some silver lining somewhere in there, but I will not sugarcoat the experiences of young people, young women in the Caribbean, and other countries of the global south, because then it gives the impression that we're okay and we're not. And so we need to plan for an approach that we have taken, we need to reverse the approach that we have taken to development and planning, one that does not widen the current gap that we have. We need to plan for one that mainstreams equity, mainstreams fairness and gender parity. We need to reimagine leadership and governance at every level, but more so at the global level. These systems and organizations that have been set up to work, to do good and to do well, need to work and do well. And we can't continue to pretend that, somehow behind the scenes they're doing what they need to. We need to reimagine our future to prioritize intergenerational equity, gendered and feminist approaches to problem solving and solutions development, and a firm commitment to recreating the world order. It's not working. And I'll say, final statement, we cannot wait to build back better. We must build back better right now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Constable. I thought there was a very eloquent articulation of the range of issues which women, young people in the Caribbean, small island states, particularly subject to extreme weather events and so on and so forth, are facing. Allow me to make a couple of remarks before I invite Alcinda to a selection of the comments for discussion. The speakers might want to use this opportunity also to look at the comments. There was a lot of favorable comments, for example, in response to Aisha Constable's remarks a moment ago. What I think is very important for us to recognize is that we are far from seeing the end of the pandemic. Unfortunately, the developing countries, in particular the global south, is grossly handicapped by a couple of things. Firstly, there has been no strong response, particularly from the countries where the pharmaceutical and other transnational corporations seem to be based, to make available the personal protective equipment, the treatments, as well as the vaccines available much more affordably. As a result of this, for example, there are very few poor countries who have even signed up for COVAX, the facility to make access available more ostensibly, more equitably. So we have a situation where it is very likely that this pandemic will be protracted, and the consequence of this pandemic being protracted is a likelihood of greater variants, greater types of the virus evolving and mutating, and all this is to jeopardize not only those who are directly exposed to these to the virus, but all of us in the world today. Now, this problem is further. So we are now in a situation where the pandemic has become endemic, and we will have to live with this for quite some time to come. And the longer we delay action because we do not make the means of dealing with the contagion more easily accessible, particularly to poor countries and poor people, the more difficult it is going to be. This is a major problem. A second problem, of course, is that developing countries particularly have been hesitant to undertake stronger fiscal measures, partly because they are constrained by debt and other burdens. And the consequence of this is that while rich countries have generally been bold in terms of spending a great deal and have been able to vaccinate most of their populations fairly quickly and will do so before the end of the year, we are likely to see a true track recovery. If there's a recovery you can speak of in the global south, especially in the poor countries. This is going to be a very dangerous situation. So whatever little progress was achieved during the early years of the SDGs, and we should note that we were already behind schedule as far as the SDG progress was concerned before the pandemic. This is all going to be further set back in the current situation. So we have the means to overcome this, and I think it's very important for us to learn from each other. It's very important to note, for example, that so-called all-of-shelter lockdowns have not been a feature of most of the countries in East Asia, and even, for example, in Southwest India, in the state of Kerala, which have been best able to contain the contagion fairly effectively. Outside of the 3 provinces around Wuhan city in China, there was no stay-in-shelter lockdown at the provincial level, or let alone at the national level. This is also true in Japan, in the Republic of Korea, South Korea. It's also true of the Taiwan province of China, of even poorer countries like Vietnam and Laos, and of course, as I mentioned earlier, the state of Kerala. How was this avoided? Largely due to all of government approaches. In all too many countries, we are taking an approach which focuses largely on health measures and sometimes on police measures. Very little else is involved. And this is very unfortunate. There are no reorganization of schools, for example, as Aisha Constable reminded us, no reorganization of the workplace to minimize the likelihood of contagion, and so on and so forth. So we have not seen the kinds of changes which are necessary, which would come about only through an all-of-government approach, and very, very importantly, through a whole-of-society approach, mobilizing all of society. These are some of the options which have been successful to varying degrees in some parts of the world, and I think it's very important for us, recognizing that COVID-19 is now endemic, that we take measures, including extraordinary measures, to deal with this better in ways which are far less disruptive and will basically do as little harm as possible. And we should not forget, for example, very difficult subjects such as mental health and the difficulties in my own society in Malaysia, for example. The number of suicides has been increasing at an alarming rate, and this mainly involves young people who are in a state of despair and trauma, despite the fact that Malaysia is considered a relatively high upper middle income country on the cusp of becoming a rich country. So without further ado, let me now invite Alcinda to read some of the questions and comments for the panel to respond to. Alcinda, please.
Thank you, Jomo, and thank you to our speakers for these brilliant analysis and reflections on the pressing issues that we're living with today. One of the questions that we have here is from David Wuma. It's directed to Duncan Green, but I would like to expand this because in a way, I think Duncan raises an interesting issue about the role of the state and the revitalization of the role of the state. But I would like to frame it, and I hope Duncan will not be, David Wuma will not be upset for me to expand a little bit his question to allow more of our speakers to intervene, because we've been talking about the vaccine apartheid that Michel CDB mentioned, but Duncan also mentioned the apartheid of money and resources. And both Georgie and Duncan mentioned the issue of creating a new social contract between citizens and government, but also between businesses and workers. And Aisha mentioned that this pandemic is a dress rehearsal, in a very interesting expression, dress rehearsal to climate change. And which in a way echoes issues that Georgie was mentioning about a crisis within a crisis. And so in that sense, Duncan's David question that says that what does it mean for different states and regions based on the existing disparities to address these issues and taking care of the advanced levels and taking care of how to make better the situation in these states and regions. In a way, I think the question is to reflect how do we revitalize the state and citizens' engagement and social contract, but also how do we mitigate the situation of being, you know, living a crisis within the crisis, and how you prioritize, how do you engage all these issues. I hope the question is not too complicated, but I think all the speakers could intervene on this one, taking their own experiences, approaches, areas of expertise, etc. So that would be the first one, Jomo.
Alcinda, because we don't have all that much time, and we are going to invite all the speakers to respond. If you have any other questions which you would like to share with the panel, could you please do so now?
Yes, I will do a second one, which comes from Nyeleti. And she says, as discussed, the COVID-19 pandemic has cast a very sharp light on existing social economic inequalities within nations and across the globe. Could any or each of the speakers suggest concrete social policy changes in their fields of expertise that can contribute to building more equitable societies in which no one is left behind? So in a way, there is an interlinkage between these two questions that could be, they are fairly broad for you to expand on more specific social policy issues. And I have a third question of my own that I would add also to the speakers, is that the widespread and challenging impacts created by the pandemic have called for novel approaches and for building new solidarities globally, as both Michel CDB mentioned, but many other speakers mentioned that as well. So what should be the role of the United Nations in fostering a new kind of multilateralism based on more solidarity and greater equity? So this also is a question addressed to all speakers for them to comment on the issue. So that's all I have for now, and I'll see if we have another round if more questions come up. Thank you.
Alcinda, without further ado, let me invite the panelists, since the opening statements were slightly longer, allow me to invite them in the same order and to address the issues. So, and then for the last round, if we have another round, I would like to change the order and reverse the order. Clearly, almost all the speakers do not agree with the idea of going back to the past, but rather they want to go forward. So rather than build back better or the great reset as Davos would have it, we are really talking about building forward better. So let me now invite Dr. Michelle Sidibé to address us. Michelle, please.
Thank you very much, Jomo. I will try just to speak in English because I was the only one to speak in French. So let me come back quickly to your questions. I think first, I would like to just beg all of us to start thinking about a bigger framework. We have been in this for more than 30 to 40 years. Any type of major problems which arise, we found ourselves in situation where we saw this divide between people who have and people who don't have, countries who can afford and countries who cannot afford. I know myself that I was really advocating strongly to make sure that HIV drugs could be made available to poor people. It took us almost 8 to 9 years before we managed to make that drugs available, when we knew that it was already in the north and it was already saving life of people, prolonging life of people, making them capable to change completely the way they could contribute to the transformation of their country. So the fundamental issues from my point of view is to first consider that what we are faced with today is human security issues. In most of the cases, we are locked in an approach which take us in isolation, trying to deal with the issues in a fragmented way, and not seeing, like Aisha said, certainly more horizontal type of approach, which will help us to deal with deeper issues, which are issues of inequalities and issues of how we deal with distribution of opportunities in the society, which are not equal at all. When you look at the science, when you look at what is happening, I can tell you, for example, malaria is killing more than 400,000 people every year in my continent. Malaria has been discovered 141 years ago in Constantine in Algeria. Until today, we don't have vaccine, we don't have a medicine. So when it took just 1 year with COVID to have 10 different types of vaccine. So what I want to say is that we need, and that was the sense of my focus today, or my talk, is we need really a new global debate on health democracy. What means health democracy for us? What we need to be able to do is to shift the paradigm, to make sure that a new solidarity will come, which will help us to really think about how to really deal with these fundamental issues, which has been always pushed aside. Is health in some cases is a public good or not? It is something which we need to really discuss seriously. What will be helping us to make sure that we put really in the center of all we are doing today, the whole financial vulnerability we have been talking, which is pushing more and more of those people. We know that most of the people in the continent today, they pay for their health, unfortunately. We know that more than hundreds of millions of people are pushed under poverty because of their health status, and particularly COVID will push more of them in that situation. So from my point of view, the debate needed to really place the centrality of the new type of solidarity, making sure that the UN could enter the multilateralism, I can say that framework, bring a new debate around health democracy. What means health democracy? What means when we are in type of situation, equality, equity, how that can happen? Because it's good to talk about, we will stop. I talk about endemic situation. I talk about all what Domo was mentioning. But if you have only today 8 million people who receive 2 doses of a COVID vaccine out of 1.3 billion people, how you will control this epidemic, this pandemic? Impossible. So is issues which I want to say need to be addressed from the perspective of certainly better equity. Is not just by taking state by state. We will never be able to do it. We need to have a collective voice which could come, which can really be stronger, which can be organized around a new debate. So without this debate, I don't think we will be able to do it.
You muted, Jomo.
I was complimenting Dr. Sidibe on his remarks and particularly on the pertinence of these remarks, because things don't happen unless people fight and struggle for them. And his remarks about HIV are still very relevant. I mean, if not for the effort of the first post-apartheid president of South Africa, Nelson Mandela, fought very, very hard for the public health exception to the TRIPS agreement of 1995. And it was only in 2001, after 9/11 and after the fiasco in Seattle, when the African governments walked out of the WTO ministerial negotiations, that finally there were concessions made. But now, because there is no such pressure, even though you have a pandemic where less than 2% have been less than 4% of Africans have been able to get vaccines, and less than 2% of the vaccines in the world have gone to Africa. There doesn't seem to be a sense of urgency about addressing the challenge. And this is very sad. I mean, it really shows the need for multilateral action, as some people have pointed out, but also the immorality as we look for private solutions to what are clearly public health challenges and challenges affecting the people. But let me not get ahead of this and invite Professor Sikata to address us on these questions.
Jomo, could you please move to Duncan Green? Professor Sikata went to get her charger. She's low on battery. She just sent me a message. She will be next. After
of course. Professor Green then.
These are universal problems we all face. Thank you, John. I mean, there's a really fascinating questions, a huge range of possible responses, so I'll just pick out a few. So David Uma on the role of the state, some examples, money. Okay, so whatever happened to austerity, certainly in Europe and the US, magic money trees are everywhere. The question, I think, is it felt a little bit like that early on in 2008, and will at some point that revert to a very disequalizing form of austerity is something to watch out for. But both in terms of spending and borrowing, an extraordinary change in the role of the state in terms of pumping resources into a crisis. A much greater awareness, I think, of issues of precarity, resilience, how societies and individuals are affected by and survive or don't survive shocks, these sudden earthquakes that hit you. And as Aisha said, this is a dry run for climate change. And it seems to me that the whole debate around social protection and universal basic income is basically thinking of this as a system which needs better safety nets, better shock absorbers. And that means a systemic approach to social policy where, for example, we have automatic social protection systems which can scale up as soon as a crisis comes rather than waiting for new laws to be passed, that kind of thing. Final one, corruption. Huge anger in many countries around corruption in sourcing vaccines and PPE. And this has really put a spotlight on the role of particularly corrupt governments, populists. I'm not saying only populists are corrupt, but they're quite good at it. This has clearly could lead to some big political changes in terms of citizen and social scrutiny of the state. Something else I wanted to mention was the whole question of civil society. We've got a really interesting project. We convened a global conversation around emergent agency. What kind of civil society agency has emerged in response to the pandemic? Aisha touched on some areas of it. We're seeing an upsurge in some areas, but we're seeing very contradictory pressures. So we're seeing many civil society organizations going back to doing more service delivery, actually helping people with the material benefits. And that could lead to a revitalization of their social standing, their social contract, their acceptance by society. We're seeing in other countries a real squeeze on civil society space. In Uganda, President Museveni, he basically wants to do it all himself. He doesn't want civil society getting in the way or taking the credit. So some really interesting differential impacts on the social contract between civil society and the state. And the final thing I wanted to talk about, and this maybe comes back to Alcinda's point on the role for the UN, we are seeing a lot of othering. We're seeing a lot of blaming of outgroups, of minorities, of foreigners, nationalism with a nasty edge. And I think that's one thing where you can see the UN playing a really vital role in trying to prevent that outburst in a very nasty end, the reverse of multilateralism, unilateralism, and even within a country, fragmentation based on in-groups and out-groups, which I think has a lot of very nasty potential still.
Thank you, Duncan. I thought you might address the question of, the European governments, for example, refusing to agree to the TRIPS waiver and refusing to allow developing countries to manufacture the tests, the equipment, and other things to contain this contagion. Because if we're going to be living with this for quite some time, we really need to have everything at our disposal. And particularly for poor countries, it's really quite tragic. Many poor countries have not even booked any vaccines at COVAX. They can't afford it. And this is, of course, terrible. And then we have everybody talking about, how all these developing countries have gone into debt. They cannot go into any more debt. They cannot spend. They cannot deal with this crisis. These are issues which you have written about, I know, and I think need to be aired as well. So I see the system as corrupt. It's not simply a personal corruption, as I see it. But let me invite Aisha Constable to speak to us before Georgie.
Thank you. And again, just co-signing on everything that has been said by the other panelists. We talk about the vaccine situation, and I read somewhere that what one source says it will take 57 years for the developing world to be fully vaccinated, and it's just an unacceptable reality that we're facing. And we see a similar situation with climate change. It will take probably twice as many years for the global south to be fully resilient in terms of having access to all the technologies that are required, all the frameworks and systems that need to be put in place for us to be truly resilient. So the question that you asked, Nileti, of the social policies that are required, it's a difficult one to answer, and we certainly cannot answer it only on the basis of social policy, because it has to happen in tandem with fiscal policies and, you know, all the other political changes, systemic changes that need to happen for that to be successful. One of the things that countries all over the world, but I know the Caribbean experience, countries are now developing what we call nationally determined contributions to outline our adaptation and mitigation targets to climate change. This is to submit to the UNFCCC. And one of the things that we're emphasizing is the need for that document to be truly inclusive and gender responsive and sensitive to all the needs of vulnerable populations, because those are spaces where, you know, countries should outline their approach, but more importantly, we can hold them accountable once that's documented, right? So I would say in response to that, it's a matter of aligning all the different policies, all the different systems across the different, you know, streams of things that need to happen, and ensuring that in all that we're doing, we're considering the most vulnerable communities and populations in all spaces. And that approach also needs to come from the top down in terms of how the UNFCCC is set up and how it works to ensure that all communities across the global south are truly involved in this process, and not just as possible dumping grounds for these technologies that rich countries are developing, and not just because they can siphon off these carbon credits, which is a mechanism for, you know, a market-based mechanism to solve a market-based problem. It just is untenable. And if I can go back to the first question about the state, I think to answer that, we have to examine how the governance systems and leadership systems in these countries would have emerged in the first instance. I know that in the Caribbean experience, because we emerged out of colonial societies, in many cases, our current governments are seen as extensions of the plantocracy. And so people remain distrustful. And so, you know, Green spoke about corruption, rampant. There's no way people are going to trust these governments anytime soon, because that is so ingrained in the operations. But to navigate that, I think one of the things that governments now have to examine is how they now brand themselves, how they practice leadership, how they practice governance. It's a total reworking of leadership and governance in our societies to create that trust that is going to be needed. And I think a big part of how the state figures in the post-pandemic era is going to rest on how they figured during the pandemic. How were governments successful? How did they manage a pandemic? That will determine whether or not post this period people have any faith in these structures. And you know, just to look beyond the state somewhat, as much as there is a huge responsibility and a role for the state to play, Prof. Green, you mentioned it, CSOs and NGOs have for a long time been carrying a lot of the weight that the state should carry. And now, you know, we recognize as well that to bolster that and for that to be effective, we need more of the people power to hold this up. Like, we cannot continue to depend on the state. And so, you know, a big part of that is empowering the populace of these countries in terms of capacity and education, awareness and tools, everything to be able to do for themselves some of those things that we now rely on the state to do, albeit understanding that we cannot absolve the state of its responsibility. And finally, in response to the question of the UN, and not to sound facetious at all, Alcinda, but the UN needs to do what it was set up to do. And the UN cannot pander to individual governments and states, and the UN needs to be responsive to the real needs on the ground. Like, this idea of lumping stories together and putting a band-aid on a situation will only take us back a couple years to where we started. Like, there's no progress that's going to be made by, you know, tiptoeing around the issue and political correctness. I know what UN does, and I know it's diplomacy, and I know it's consensus, and I know it's placating people in some instances, because that is required to get results sometimes, but that is not going to get us to the heart of the problem. I remember being in Africa 2 years ago, and a colleague of mine from Europe, you know, we were in Sao Tome, and we walked around, and, you know, the poverty was prevalent and it's everywhere. And you know, he said, a European guy, he said, well, their life is hard for them and then they die. And my spirit died, my heart just kind of sank, because that is the perspective of people who occupy decision-making spaces. Not all of them, but some of them. And I think that is a narrative and a rhetoric that we really need to challenge, because that I think is at the root of what we're seeing now in terms of the dismissive nature in an approach to governance and to inequality and inclusiveness. And if the UN plays a role in disbanding that approach to development and to treating with world issues, then the UN would have done well, in my estimation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aisha.
Yeah, I'm here. Yes, I'm
Professor Sikata, please.
Yes, thank you. The value of speaking last is that everyone has already said what you barely thought of, and probably will say it better than you could ever say it. So I want to thank my fellow panelists in that regard. I wanted to start with this issue of multilateralism and the fact that it does not seem to work for Africa. It seems to be that there's a two-tier multilateralism. It can be used to basically make poor countries do what rich countries want them to do. I think the lesson that we need to learn from this pandemic and the response of rich countries is that really, if multilateralism will work well, then Africa has to be given the space to develop the ability to take its health destiny into its own hands. I think one of the biggest scandals that we had in this crisis was that while we were wringing our hands about vaccine nationalism and so on, is a big question of why Africa didn't have capacity to produce vaccines. We can all refer to TRIPS agreements and so on. But within that space, I think India and other countries fought for the kind of space which African countries did not take advantage of. So it's really important that our leaders learn the hard lessons about what has happened with the fact that people are willing for populations in other parts of the world to die while they hoard vaccines that they will not use. As far as I can see, many Western countries are not planning to use their AstraZeneca vaccines, but they won't give it to African countries where many people are being vaccinated with AstraZeneca vaccines. The second thing about the lessons that I think Africa should learn has to do with the question of debt that Joe Moyu raised. Right now, many African countries are borrowing large sums of money around to manage their COVID situation. But the big question, so there will be debt. But the big question is that what is this money being used for? And this is what I was talking about when I talked earlier on about the social contract. Governments have become much more autocratic. They are hiding behind COVID containment to basically shut up oppositions, very draconian measures, passing laws wider than they need in the COVID situation and so on. It's time really to put a stop to that, because I really liked what Aisha said when she said that how states behave during the pandemic will affect how they are viewed by their citizens. And this is something which citizens really need the space and the organization to pay attention to. We have a number of crises around the continent that have been precipitated by COVID, but were there before COVID. In thinking about the responses to these crises and in holding states responsible, we really have to pay attention to what we need states for, what states should be doing in a time of crisis. My next point, my last but one point, is to raise an issue about employment and labor conditions. I think that's one of the biggest crises that we are facing in Africa today. And in the conversations around labor issues, there seems to be an assumption that everybody has an employer that they can force to improve their conditions. We know that the majority of working Africans are self-employed, either smallholders or informal workers and so on. And so I think one of the biggest challenges facing Africa going forward is how to ensure the livelihoods of its informal workers and its smallholder farmers, so that they can perform their role in the economic recovery of Africa. So in terms of policies, we are really, we need to return to the issue of income support and access to essential services for themselves and their families. And access to essential services is a really critical issue because for a long time now, that has been taken off the policy debates about how to make life, how to make a sound livelihood in Africa. And yet, what COVID has shown is that in a state of the deterioration of essential services in Africa has hampered the effort to deal with this problem. Linked with that is the question of food insecurity, and I don't have the time to go into that, but there's a lot of hunger in this period, and it is created by an already existing situation of seasonal food insecurities, plus the volatility in food availability and food prices. And many poor households are suffering. And this is a huge problem. The last bit of this issue has to do with the explosion of unpaid work, women's unpaid work burdens. I think one of the criminal things occurring now is the expectation that women who do not have a lot of education are in charge of educating young people, doing homework and teaching them at home when schools are closed and so on. Some of the points Aisha made about dealing with the crisis in education should be linked with this business of dealing and reducing with women's unpaid work burden in this period. And those are the things that social policy can really do. I think taxation is a very important part of securing access to these essential services. And we need a fundamental change in taxation. In 2020, the Ghana government, for example, gave a number of tax holidays and tax reduction measures, puts in place a number of tax reduction measures for workers. This year, it has upped all the taxes, and many of them are regressive taxes. They are on consumption, and it's really squeezing workers. There's a lot of discontent about taxation. At the same time, it has not said a word about taxation to the transnational corporations that are running the economy, the mining companies and so on. They continue not to have to pay for taxes. This clearly is a huge area of reform, because if we do not address this problem, the debt is only going to grow. And governments are not being accountable for what they are taking the debt to do. It is future generations that are going to bear the burden. And I think the UN has a large role in creating the space for these fundamental conversations, whether it's at the level of the General Assembly, the Security Council, the WTO, and so on. I think questions that were taboo, the things that were no longer to be addressed, the fundamental questions about the global economic and political order and so on, really have to come back into view and be addressed in robust ways, and in a spirit of having learned the lessons that COVID-19 taught us. Otherwise, we are doomed to repeat this crisis over and over again. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Sikata. One of the questions which Alcinda raised earlier, which we did not address, is the whole question of social policy. But I think if we take a broad view of social policy, Dr. Sidibe raised the question of vaccine apartheid. And now it is taking a very, very pernicious form. The European Commission announced last week that only 4 vaccines will be recognized for entry to Europe, for example. And even in the case of AstraZeneca, only the AstraZeneca made in Europe will be allowed. AstraZeneca manufactured in India is not going to be acceptable in Europe. This is a very, very dangerous new type of vaccine apartheid, which is, it's really going to be very troublesome, very problematic in terms of future relations among the people of the world. But the other question which Alcinda raised is the whole question of social policy. I think many countries have suddenly realized that the lack of social protection, the absence of social protection measures has been found particularly wanting and glaring in the present situation. Analytically, however, and from a pragmatic policy point of view, I think it's very important for us to distinguish between social protection policies generally and social protection which is needed in response to this crisis. And there are obviously some very urgent temporary relief measures. For example, many working people in the informal sector, they desperately need to live. They need relief. And unfortunately, that is lacking at a time when you would expect much more generosity. We see even a decline in ODA and some of those other things, and an increase in the charges which are being incurred, even for food and so on. And many African countries, for example, are no longer, Africa used to be a net food exporter. Now it is a net food importer, 3 decades since the 1980s. So that is one big set of issues which obviously needs to be addressed, and I hope the panelists will address this. You each will have 1 minute to make your concluding remarks before we close up. And the other issue I'd like to remind you of is the whole challenge of work and the whole question of well-being, which we have made some mention of, but perhaps not enough. But as far as work and well-being is concerned, I think there's a new appreciation of the importance of care work. And this, I think, is a very, very important new appreciation, the importance of care work and what we need to do in terms of improving care work and appreciating it in terms of government spending as well as other forms of spending. I think this cannot be underestimated. So when we think about social spending, about health and about education, we need also to begin to think seriously about how care services, which have often been largely undertaken by families, increasingly we need to think of new forms of social organization and of government organization and of fiscal resources for that. So let me then now ask each of the speakers to make their closing remarks. I'm afraid we only have time for about 1 minute each before I ask Alcinda to take the floor again. So can I begin? I'm not going to reverse it as I said I would earlier, and I'll ask Dr. Sidibe to give us 1 minute of his most important points he wants to reiterate.
Thank you, Jomo. Yes, thank you, Jomo. I want just to say something to remind us something which is just the sign of lack of proper solidarity. Today, we have 1.2 billion people in Africa who have not been able to receive 1 dose of vaccine, when the developed world is calling for a third vaccine, boosting the vaccine, making sure that their people can be better protected. So I continue to feel that it is crucial to reinvent a new model of solidarity and to achieve greater equity between the nations. I was just giving this example because it's a sign of a lack of in proper solidarity between the nations. And without pushing that back, without making people understanding that the right to live should be equal everywhere, that the respect of the dignity of people should be recognized everywhere. And we could not continue to just sit and say, we don't produce vaccine, not yet, but we will start producing vaccine. But meantime, 1 billion of people will be unfortunately further marginalized, and further pushed into poverty.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sidibe. I still remember that when Dr. Jonas Salk came up with the polio vaccine in the 1950s, he was asked about why he hadn't patented it for himself. He said, "This is a people's vaccine. It's like trying to patent the sun." And unfortunately, we have a very different world in which we live in today. So the challenge for people like you who are working in this area is really formidable. And I wish you all the best. Let me now invite Professor Sikata to make her closing remarks.
Okay. So in the minute that I wanted to comment on your point about the renewed appreciation for care work. I would like to suggest that this is still rhetorical. It's something we say, in the spectacle of the British clapping for NHS workers with their pots and pans every evening is an example of that kind of rhetorical appreciation. If we really want to do something about care work, there are three things we need to do. We first of all have to recognize the contribution of care to the economy, to economic growth and development, and to also recognize that it is women who are doing the bulk of care work and that they face challenges in being full citizens because of the burden of care work. Secondly, we need to invest in services that support care work, but also reduce its drudgery. In many parts of Africa, care work is really, really, really tedious and onerous. And thirdly, we need to work for a more democratic redistribution of care work within the home and also the socialization of care work outside. I think we need to fight for a society in which men actually see care as an integral part of what it means to be a citizen. I also wanted to make a plug for workers' cooperatives. I think in this whole discussion about organizing workers' organizations and the ways in which workers can begin to realize themselves as workers, and in a context where many workers do not have employers, I think Africa has to rethink and relook at cooperatives and to see how we can support cooperatives to become a vibrant alternative to workers' organizations again. I was very excited and honored to see farmers in India take on the Indian state in recent times to make a case for their interests. And I think this is a lesson that farmers in Africa can learn and to see the ways in which they can also begin to organize themselves to ensure that they get what they deserve from African states. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Georgie. You know, in my country now, people are cynical about the politicians for the reasons which Duncan mentioned earlier. But the new heroes are really those who are in the front line, not just the doctors, but all the people who are in the front line in fighting this pandemic. So I do think that there is appreciation at the popular level, but you are right that institutionally and otherwise, we do not valorize them enough. Let me now turn to Professor Green, please.
So this has been personally a great experience, not least because this has been an awful week in Britain. Our parliament voted to cut aid this week. The only major economy that's done so. It brings shame on our country. There's no two ways about it. And so to have this kind of conversation is very personally restoring when we felt terrible all week about our failures as a country. Moving on beyond my personal pain, I think what we're seeing is a sort of new, re-energized interplay of actors in development. Sometimes it's positive, sometimes it's negative, but everything is being thrown up in the air. That's what happens during these big shocks. And there are possibilities. There are threats and there are possibilities. So the really big question is, how can the UN, how can international movements grab the possibilities and prevent the threats? And just one thing, just listening to Michel Sidibe and others, 20 years ago, we were having this discussion about HIV/AIDS medicines. We were talking about patents. We were lobbying in Doha. Gemma, I think we were both there at the WTO. And it doesn't feel that different now. It doesn't feel as different as it should be. So what do we do now so that in 2041, we're not having another round of this ridiculous discussion about the imbalances of power and technological potential across the world, which prevent people who need medicines getting the medicines that exist. So I think there are huge responsibilities on the UN, on all of us. But thank you very much for this panel.
Thank you very much, Duncan. I'm particularly appreciative of these remarks because HMS Queen Elizabeth, the aircraft carrier, has just been deployed to my part of the world. So obviously there are resources for military adventurism, while there are no resources for ODA. Aisha Constable, you have the floor.
Thank you. Again, full support of what has been said, and I'm shaking my head because, you know, Prof. Green, he said some of what I was thinking in terms of when I studied history in secondary school, you know, and you read about leaders who were autocratic and who were, you know, draconian in their approach to leadership, and just some of the things that happened in the world at that time to shape it and to put us where we are. And I thought, never in my lifetime could that happen. You know, like you would never see, we never revisit those times, like we'd have institutions and people holding these folks accountable, and we wouldn't have to live through such dark times again. And it's heartrending that we're here. You know, and it's heartrending that I'm able, as much as I appreciate being able to process it, I wish I couldn't, because sometimes it's heavy. You know, you think about a lot, you think about in terms of our collective futures and what it means for where we go as a world, and it's scary. But regardless, I'm grateful for the spaces that I occupy. I'm grateful for platforms like these to share, and I'm grateful for the hope that people like yourselves give that, you know, all is not lost. I just want to say that in going forward, one of the key things I would like to see embodied in all the work from every level is the question and the matter of intergenerational equity. A recognition that the work that we're doing is not for ourselves. A recognition that the world that we live in is not ours, but we're borrowing it from future generations. And so plan with that in mind. We're not planning for climate change or COVID just for the sake of ourselves, but for the future of, you know, the next 100 years. Because if someone had not done that for today's world, then we all wouldn't be here. So we can't be selfish about that. And then it goes back to the question of what happens in the global south versus the global north. My challenge to, you know, persons who are here and occupy these decision-making spaces, have positions of power or have access to the ears of decision makers, is to take this message back, you know, in a very authentic way. Tell them that a young woman from Jamaica devastated by what's happening, and millions of young people in the Caribbean are, you know, heartbroken about this condition of the world. Because I think sometimes in our little bubbles, we think that all is well. And like I said earlier, all isn't well. And I want to say that again, big shout out to the UN. Alcinda, thank you for inviting me. I hope that the work that the UN and other institutions like the UN continue to do is work that allows us to see a shifting of power to help to balance and tilt the playing field and level the playing field rather, that has historically been tilted in the favor of global north countries. That's the only way we can get to a point where we can say we've truly attained any degree of equality, equity, parity. And it's a long way off, but if we stop working towards it, then all is going to be lost. So we continue to push on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aisha Constable. Thank you also, Duncan Green, Georgie Sikata, Michelle Sidibe. Thank you to Alcinda and the team working behind her, behind the scenes. Thank you also to the interpreters. I'm sorry I ran over time. Thank you to everybody for making this session a success in terms of the kinds of issues which were raised. And also, I hope that it will be able to enhance the division's contribution to improving policy in these very new and challenging times in which we live. Thank you all. Alcinda.
Thank you very much, Jomo, for your guidance in this discussion. Thank you to Michelle Sidibe, Duncan Green, Georgie Tsikata, Aisha Constable for great reflections touching upon very critical issues. And in the name of UNDESA and the Division for Inclusive Social Development, thank you for being with us today, and thank you for this great discussion. Thank you very much, and bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.